Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ranger Mick, and welcome to the Reptile Park's live soggy streaming. Today, I'm with one of my favourite non-reptilians here at the park. This is Adina. This is our female dingo. She's what we call a Centralian dingo. She's 7 years of age. She's been here at the park all of her life, and she really is a true delight. Now, this lovely rufous or reddish camouflage is typical of what we call the Centralian strain. These animals have regional colour forms to make them more successful. If you're a dingo in Central Australia, you tend to be this colour. If you're a dingo in the Victorian high country, you're more likely to be a creamy white colour, the Alpine strain. And if you're a dingo in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, you tend to be dark in colour, black and tan, quite a rare colour form, works extremely well in the Kimberley environment. Now, a lot of people ask us here at the park, is a dingo just a dog? And they are certainly very, very closely related. The two can actually interbreed, but there are some fundamental differences. If you're a dingo, your jaw structure is slightly different. You've got bigger teeth, on cue, beautiful, that are domestic of the same size. Now, your breeding cycle is a bit different too. Your dog at home will come into season every 6 to 8 months. Adina, 1 heat per year. Her gestational period, or days pregnant if you like, is a little bit longer than a domestic dog. Now, they breed once a year, and oddly enough, they tend to have their puppies at the very beginning of winter. Now, this is quite atypical for most animals, but what it really means is that if mum can nurse those puppies through the coldest period of the year, on the first day of spring, when everybody else is having their cute, delicious little babies, dingo puppies are already quite mature and quite predatory, and they take advantage of that bounty of protein. Now, the big question we get asked all the time is temperament, behaviour. Very, very different. This one, as you can see, very, very friendly, but at the end of the day, she is a dingo. And if a snake or a lizard or even a bird landed in this enclosure, then she reverts to her true self. Quite predatory. They practice their killing skills. Now, this is one attribute that we've been selectively breeding out of our domestic dogs. We like them to be socialised, not see other pets as potential food. Dingoes aren't quite in that category. Now, how long have they been in Australia? That's the big question. The popular consensus is that they've come from Indonesia, probably as shipboard trading animals or even food items from Indonesian seafarers who were trading with northern indigenous people. Now, this is the popular thought stream. We think they've been here for between about 3,000 and 5,000 years. Yet, there is some anecdotal evidence from the Kimberley region in Western Australia that perhaps they were here longer. Some of the Wandjina paintings depict creatures that are very, very similar to dingo. Now, their impact in Australia has been absolutely phenomenal. Because of their habit of collective hunting, unfortunately, they've pushed several species into extinction. We think they were responsible for the disappearance of thylacine on mainland Australia, or Tasmanian tiger. We also used to have a Tasmanian devil that was present on mainland Australia, but we think within a couple of thousand years of the arrival of the dingo, life became impossible. Now, this is primarily because dingoes are collective hunters. They form large packs of about 12 to 15 individuals. Most other predatory species in Australia operate singly, and unfortunately, they basically just push the devil off mainland Australia, not by hunting devils, but by removing from the food chain many of the small species that devils were reliant on. Now, one of the big issues with dingoes is, of course, farmers blame them for a lot of stock losses. Well, the reality is a dingo will kill a sheep. It's a secondary or a tertiary food item. Their preference is for kangaroos and emus. And this is very significant because overgrazing by these species really does lead to land degradation. So they really are essential in the environment. The other thing we find is that an active dingo family, or pack if you like, will suppress other predatory species, predominantly foxes and, of course, feral cats. Now, without dingoes in an environment, those two species run absolutely rampant, and they decimate some of our tiny little species, the gliders, the potoroos, the bettongs. These guys don't bother with something that small. They're interested in a big old possum, an emu, or a kangaroo. and when they're not present, unfortunately, these little guys get whacked. So believe it or not, dingoes in a rural environment actually increases the biodiversity within that environment. And some of our more switched on farmers are really starting to recognise the value of having dingoes in your environment. Now, the big problem for dingoes is not so much lack of habitat. Their big problem is hybridisation. Dingo is capable of interbreeding with a domestic dog, and currently we estimate that maybe only about 20% of our wild dog population, and we have many, many millions, only about 20% would be full-blood dingoes. The vast majority are hybrids, half and half. And unfortunately, with aerial baiting campaigns, they're indiscriminate. So if we're dropping 1080 baits to eradicate wild dogs, unfortunately, poor old dingoes go down as well. And never forget that many of those baits and poisons travel up the food chain. So the poison may have killed a dingo or a dog. It'll then be chewed on by goannas and crows and many other animals. And unfortunately, we can end up with mass death. So not too keen on the aerial baiting campaigns. Now, the future for the dingo. Well, a lot of people think, gee, they're cool. Can we get one as a pet? Look, we certainly wouldn't advise that. Maybe if you're living out in the country on a large property, have a go with a dingo, but in an urban environment, probably not. Now, the rain's coming down. She's focused on, we've got a bucket of food there. You're licking your lips, aren't you, sweetie pie? Now, we might have a couple of questions, and then what I'll do is give her a little bit of food.
How do they hunt in the wild?
How do they hunt in the wild? Two different ways. Quite often they'll hunt individually. They tend to scavenge. They'll come together for collective hunting or group or pack hunting, and they'll work in teams of 6 or 8 animals, and they will literally ambush kangaroos. They blitz attack. When those things aren't available, when we do gut studies on dingoes, believe it or not, they eat a lot of insects, a lot of reptiles, a lot of invertebrates. Ideally, kangaroo, emu, possum, all of those secondary animals, and very occasionally a field death that they might stumble across. A lot of farmers will look out and go, oh, he's killed the cow. What's far more likely a scenario is that the cow has died, and the dingoes are literally removing the carcass and, oddly enough, minimising the risk of disease on that property.
How many puppies can they have?
In captivity, they quite often have 5 or 6 because of their increased nutrient levels. In the wild, 2 to 4 and occasionally 5 is de rigueur. And mum's very, very keen on them for around about 8 weeks. At the end of that 8-week period, they're quite capable of surviving alone. Sometimes they'll be absorbed into the pack, but quite often mum and dad will abandon those pups at around about 8 weeks, particularly if the pack's already fairly large. And oddly enough, the survival rates for those little guys incredibly high. They really are very self-sufficient from a very, very young age. When we breed them here at the park, we find that by about 6 weeks of age, the pups are quite predatory. They're catching insects and bits and pieces, and they're really quite switched on. They really know what's going on.
How fast can they run?
I think they're not quite a greyhound, but they're certainly a kelpie. I think the record is about 48 kilometres an hour. Now, of course, that's not for an extended period. They tend to run out of puff fairly quickly. They're a very slightly built dog. This one meets the standard for the dingo directly. The male should be under 20 kilos, the female about 17. From tip of the snout right to the tip of the tail on a large male, 1.5 metres. On a female, generally about 1.3, and that's pretty well where Adina is here with us today.
Do they bark or howl?
They howl, and they do it for 2 reasons. You can defend territory by howling, hey, stay away, this is my patch. You can also attract family members or pack members. If you've made a significant kill, there's plenty to go. If you howl, you will draw in your relatives, and at the same time, dissuade strangers from arriving.
What do they have in common with the common dog?
Well, all the basic anatomy is relatively the same. Temperament and personality a little bit different. Right now, Adina is quite attuned to me. She's mad keen. She's almost affectionate. After I've fed her, she won't really care if I live or die until roughly this time tomorrow. So they don't really have that sort of desire for your positive affirmations, that sort of stuff. They're self-sufficient. They're in business for themselves.
All right, one last question. How much food do they need to eat?
We feed these ones around about 350 grams of red meat each and every day. In the wild, they would probably eat substantially more, but it wouldn't be uncommon for this animal to run 30 or 40 kilometres during the course of the day, and as a result, your food requirement is radically increased. So here at the park, pretty lazy old life, and so we actually do have to keep an eye on their weight because we have lots of visitors here, and of course they're always keen on the crust of a sandwich or a bit of meat pie from one of the kids. Now, you're going to hop up here, sweetie pie? Up you come. There we go. Righto. There we are. A true delight, really and truly. But my advice is, if you want a dog, get a dog. Alrighty, this is very close to a dog, very similar, but not actually a dog. See ya.